Hello everyone. Before we begin this incredible story, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like to help me out. Now, get ready for a journey that will touch your heart. The rain drummed against the windows of the Buckhead mansion like tears against glass, each drop echoing the sorrow that had settled into every corner of the Thompson home. Michael Thompson stood in his study, staring at yet another medical bill, $127,000 for the latest consultation with Dr. Heinrich Müller from Switzerland. The number blurred before his eyes, not from the strain of reading, but from the weight of 3 years of disappointment. At 40, Michael had built a real estate empire that stretched across Georgia, but all his success felt meaningless now. The marble floors of his Atlanta mansion, the crystal chandeliers, the view of the city skyline, none of it mattered when his 7-year-old twin sons, Jack and Peter, lived in perpetual darkness upstairs. Mr. Thompson, Rose, the boy's nanny, appeared in the doorway, her face etched with the same exhaustion that had become everyone's companion in this house. "They're crying again." Michael closed his eyes, letting the familiar sound wash over him, that heartbreaking sob that came from the boys' room every afternoon, as predictable as the Georgia sun setting over the horizon. It wasn't the demanding cry of typical children. It was the deep, soul-crushing weep of 2 little boys who had never seen their father's face, never watched a sunset, never known the joy of chasing butterflies in their sprawling garden. "The same as yesterday?" Michael asked, though he already knew the answer. "They won't eat, won't play with their toys, won't even let me read to them," Rose whispered, her voice breaking. "They just sit there, Mr. Thompson, like they're waiting for something that will never come." Michael walked to the window, his reflection ghost-like against the rain-soaked glass. Behind him, the walls displayed his achievements. Framed photos with Georgia's governor, business awards, newspaper clippings praising his success. But none of those accolades could heal what was broken in his sons. Jennifer should be here, he thought, his hand unconsciously moving to the wedding ring he still wore. His wife had died during the difficult birth that brought Jack and Peter into the world, and with her last breath she had whispered, "Love them enough for both of us." How do you love someone enough when you can't fix what's broken? How do you tell 2 7-year-olds that their world will always be darkness when your own world feels just as dark? The medical reports lay scattered across his mahogany desk like accusations. Dr. Robert Stevens from the Atlanta Center for Ophthalmology had been definitive. Congenital blindness, complete bilateral cortical visual impairment. There is no treatment, no hope for improvement, Mr. Thompson. I'm sorry. That diagnosis had sent Michael on a desperate worldwide quest. London specialists, Tokyo researchers, experimental treatments in Germany, $2.5 million spent chasing miracles that never materialized. Each failed attempt had drained more than his bank account. It had drained his hope. But it was the sound from upstairs that hurt most, not just crying, but the complete absence of childhood joy. Other 7-year-olds would be playing video games, building with blocks, drawing pictures. Jack and Peter just existed. Michael climbed the curved staircase, each step feeling heavier than the last. The boys' room was perpetually dim, heavy curtains drawn tight against the daylight that Dr. Stevens said would only aggravate their condition. 2 small figures sat on their beds, facing each other but not truly together, lost in their own private darkness. "Hey, boys," Michael said softly, kneeling between their beds. "Daddy," Jack's voice was barely a whisper. "Is Mommy coming today?" The question hit Michael like a physical blow. For 3 years he had explained that Mommy was in heaven, but the boys seemed unable to grasp the finality of death. In their dark world, perhaps the concept of gone forever was too abstract to understand. "No, son, Mommy can't come back, but Daddy's here." Peter reached out blindly, finding his father's hand. "Daddy, why can't we see you? Why can't we see anything?" Michael pulled both boys close, feeling their small bodies shake with quiet sobs. What could he tell them? That sometimes life was unfair, that their mother's difficult pregnancy had somehow damaged their vision, that every doctor in the world had looked at their case and shaken their heads in defeat. "I don't know, boys, but I'm not giving up. I'll never give up on you." As he held them, Michael made a silent promise to Jennifer's memory and to his sons. Somehow, some way, he would find an answer. He would not let his boys spend their lives sitting in darkness, crying for a mother they'd never see and a world they'd never experience. But what he didn't know was that the answer was about to knock on his front door in the form of a 28-year-old woman from East Atlanta, carrying nothing but hope and a mother's intuition that would change everything. The sound of the doorbell echoed through the mansion, and Michael wondered if this time, finally, someone might bring light to his family's endless darkness. Sarah Johnson stood before the imposing iron gates of 1247 Habersham Road, her worn tennis shoes a stark contrast to the manicured perfection of Buckhead's most exclusive neighborhood. The Thompson mansion rose before her like something from a movie, 3 stories of brick and ivy, with windows that seemed to watch her approach. At 28, Sarah had seen enough hardship to last several lifetimes, but she had learned that dignity didn't depend on the size of your bank account. Her small apartment in East Atlanta might be a world away from this grandeur, but she carried herself with the quiet strength of someone who had survived loss and emerged with her heart intact. The job listing had been simple. Housekeeper needed for private family. Discretion required. $500 per week. For someone cleaning offices at night and working weekend shifts at a diner, it represented the kind of financial stability she had only dreamed of. Mrs. Helen, the stern-faced head housekeeper, answered the door with the efficiency of someone accustomed to screening potential help. "You must be Sarah Johnson. Mr. Thompson is waiting in his study." As Sarah followed Mrs. Helen through marble hallways lined with artwork worth more than most people's homes, she noticed something unsettling, an oppressive quiet that seemed unnatural in a house with children. The silence felt heavy, broken only by their footsteps echoing off the polished floors. Michael Thompson rose from behind an enormous desk as she entered his study. He was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 40, with the kind of refined appearance that spoke of private schools and country clubs. But his eyes told a different story. They held a depth of sadness that Sarah recognized from her own mirror after losing her baby daughter 3 years ago. "Miss Johnson, thank you for coming. Please sit down." Sarah settled into the leather chair across from his desk, noting how he seemed to study her face as if searching for something. "The position is primarily housekeeping," he began, "but I need to be very clear about one important requirement." "Yes, sir?" "My sons, they're upstairs. They have a medical condition that requires complete quiet and minimal disturbance. Under no circumstances are you to interact with them or interfere with their routine. Rose, their nanny, handles all their care." Something in his tone made Sarah's maternal instincts prick up. She had helped raise her younger brother Marcus after he lost his sight in an accident at age 5. She knew the sounds that blind children made, the way they moved, played, laughed. But this house had no such sounds. "May I ask what condition they have, sir?" "I have some experience with visual impairment." Michael's expression tightened. "Complete congenital blindness. The doctors have been very clear. They cannot be cured, and stimulation only causes them distress. That's why the house is kept quiet." Sarah nodded, but something didn't sit right with her. Blind children, in her experience, were often more vocal than sighted children, using sound to navigate their world. This silence felt wrong. As if summoned by their conversation, a soft sobbing began from somewhere upstairs. Not the demanding cry of a tantrum, but a deep, heartbroken weeping that made Sarah's chest tighten with recognition. She had made that same sound after losing her daughter. Michael's face crumpled slightly. That's normal. The doctors say it's part of their condition." But Sarah knew better. That wasn't the cry of medical distress. It was the sound of children who had given up hope. She had heard it before from Marcus during his darkest days after the accident. Before, she had helped him discover that blindness didn't mean the end of joy. "I'd like the job, Mr. Thompson," she said quietly. "I understand the requirements." As Michael explained her duties and showed her through the house, Sarah's mind was already working. The curtains were drawn tight in every room, keeping out the Georgia sunshine that should have been streaming through those beautiful windows. The boys' bedrooms were shrouded in darkness, toys scattered unused on the floor. But it was what she noticed in the kitchen that really caught her attention. A medical report left open on the counter, partially hidden under some mail. As Mrs. Helen stepped out to get her cleaning supplies, Sarah couldn't resist a quick glance. "Patient exhibits possible residual light perception." She read silently, before the sound of returning footsteps made her step away. Residual light perception. But Mr. Thompson had said complete blindness. As she drove home to East Atlanta that evening, Sarah's mind churned with questions. Something wasn't adding up. The crying, the excessive darkness, the discrepancy in the medical reports, and most telling of all, the way Michael Thompson looked like a man carrying a secret too heavy for his shoulders. She thought of Marcus, now 25, and successfully working as a computer programmer, happily married with a baby on the way. He had been just like those boys once, lost, hopeless, convinced his life was over. But with patience, love, and the right approach, he had learned not just to cope with blindness, but to thrive. That night, as Sarah lay in her small bed in her small apartment, she made a decision that would change 4 lives forever. She would take the job, yes, but she could not ignore the sound of children crying for help, even if their own father couldn't hear it. Tomorrow she would begin cleaning the Thompson mansion, but more importantly, she would begin listening, really listening, to what Jack and Peter were trying to tell the world. And if her suspicions were right, what she discovered would shatter everything the Thompson family thought they knew about hope, healing, and the power of a mother's intuition to see truth where doctors saw only darkness. Sarah's first week at the Thompson mansion followed the same heartbreaking pattern. Every morning at 8, she would arrive to the sound of muffled crying from the 2nd floor. Every afternoon, she would clean the spotless rooms while that same despairing sob echoed through the halls, and every evening, she would drive home with her heart heavier than when she'd arrived. But Sarah Johnson was not someone who could ignore a child's pain. On her 8th day, as she polished the already gleaming banister, the crying upstairs grew particularly intense. Rose had stepped out to run errands, Mrs. Helen was busy with laundry, and Mr. Thompson was at his office downtown. The house felt eerily empty, except for the sound of 2 little boys lost in their private darkness. Sarah set down her cleaning cloth and made a decision that would change everything. She climbed the stairs, following the sound to a partially open door. Through the gap she could see 2 small figures sitting on matching beds, facing each other, but somehow completely alone. Jack and Peter Thompson were beautiful children, with their father's dark hair and what should have been bright, curious eyes. But those eyes stared sightlessly ahead, and their small faces were streaked with tears that seemed endless. Sarah's heart broke completely. "Hello?" she said softly from the doorway. "My name is Sarah." Both boys froze mid-sob, their heads turning toward her voice with an alertness that surprised her. Blind children who had been blind from birth typically didn't have such precise directional hearing. "Who are you?" Jack whispered, his voice hoarse from crying. "I'm a friend. I work here in your house." Sarah stepped closer, noting how the boys tracked her movement by sound. "Why are you so sad?" "We're always sad," Peter said matter-of-factly. "Daddy says we can't see anything, ever. The doctors said so." Sarah knelt between their beds, her mind racing. In the dim light filtering through the heavy curtains, she studied their faces. Their eyes didn't have the cloudy appearance of congenital cataracts, nor the wandering movement typical of cortical blindness. Instead, they seemed to follow sounds with unusual precision. "Peter, I'm going to clap my hands. Can you tell me where the sound is coming from?" She clapped to his left. Instantly, his head turned directly toward the sound. She clapped above his head. Again, he looked up with perfect accuracy. She clapped behind him. He turned around completely, his gaze landing exactly where her hands had been. Sarah's heart began to race. This level of spatial accuracy was remarkable even for children who had been blind from birth. But these boys weren't just tracking general directions, they were pinpointing locations with the precision of children who might have some residual vision. "Jack, I want to try something. I'm going to make a shadow with my hand between you and the window. Tell me if you notice anything different." She moved her hand between Jack and the small amount of light seeping around the curtains. Jack's head tilted slightly. "It feels different, like something changed." Sarah's breath caught. Children with complete blindness wouldn't notice changes in ambient light patterns. "Boys, do you like games?" For the first time, she saw something other than sadness flicker across their faces. Curiosity. "What kind of games?" Peter asked. Sarah looked around the room and noticed a small radio on the dresser. An idea began to form. "Let's play a listening game. I'm going to play music, and we'll see who can guess what's happening in the song." She turned on the radio, finding a children's station playing Old MacDonald Had a Farm. As the familiar melody filled the room, Sarah began acting out the song, moving around the room, making animal sounds in different locations. And then something magical happened. Jack giggled. It was a small sound, rusty from disuse, but it was genuine laughter. Peter joined in, and soon both boys were trying to guess which animal she was pretending to be and where she was hiding in the room. "Are you the cow? Are you by the window?" Jack called out, pointing in the exact direction where Sarah was standing. "How did you know where I was?" Sarah asked, her excitement growing. "I don't know," Jack said, confusion crossing his face. "I just knew." For 30 minutes, Sarah played with Jack and Peter. She watched as color returned to their cheeks, as their posture straightened, as they laughed and moved and acted like the 7-year-old children they were supposed to be. But more importantly, she watched how they moved through space with a confidence that suggested they were seeing far more than anyone realized. When Rose's car pulled into the driveway, Sarah quickly said goodbye to the boys, promising to visit again. As she hurried downstairs, her mind was spinning with possibilities that seemed too incredible to believe. That evening, she called her brother Marcus. "Marcus, I need to ask you something. When you first lost your sight, how accurate was your spatial hearing?" "Pretty good, but nothing like it is now. That takes years to develop, Sarah. Why?" "I'm working with 2 children who supposedly have congenital blindness, but their spatial awareness is incredible, and I think they might be seeing things they don't even realize they're seeing." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "Sarah, are you saying you think they've been misdiagnosed?" "I don't know what I'm saying yet. But Marcus, they were laughing today. For the first time in years, according to their nanny, they were actually happy. And when they were happy, when they were moving and playing, they did things that seemed impossible for completely blind children. What are you going to do?" Sarah looked out her apartment window toward Buckhead, where 2 little boys were probably crying themselves to sleep again in their darkened room. "I'm going to find out the truth. Whatever it costs me, I'm going to find out what's really wrong with Jack and Peter Thompson." What she didn't know was that her simple games had already set in motion a chain of events that would expose a conspiracy, save 2 children, and bring healing to a family that had given up hope. But first, she would have to convince their father that everything he believed about his son's condition might be a lie. The next morning brought an unexpected complication. As Sarah arrived at the mansion, she found Michael Thompson waiting in the foyer, his expression unreadable. Behind him stood Dr. Robert Stevens, a man in his 60s, with silver hair and an air of authority that filled the room. "Miss Johnson," Michael said carefully, "Dr. Stevens tells me there was some unusual noise from the boys' room yesterday afternoon." Sarah's heart sank. Someone had reported her interaction with Jack and Peter. She lifted her chin, meeting both men's gazes steadily. "The children were crying. I thought perhaps some gentle distraction might help." Dr. Stevens stepped forward, his voice carrying the condescending tone of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in the room. "Miss Johnson, I'm sure your intentions were good, but you don't understand the complexity of these children's condition. Any overstimulation can cause severe neurological distress. With respect, Doctor, they seemed happier than they'd been in months." "Happiness is not the goal here," Dr. Stevens replied sharply. "These children have severe bilateral cortical visual impairment. Their brains cannot process visual information, and attempting to force such processing can cause seizures, migraines, and psychological trauma." Sarah felt her anger rising, but she forced her voice to remain calm. "Then why do they track sounds with such precision? Why do they seem to notice changes in light?" Dr. Stevens exchanged a look with Michael that Sarah couldn't quite interpret. "Miss Johnson, I've been treating visually impaired children for 30 years. I understand that it's natural for caregivers to want to see improvement where none exists. But false hope is cruel to these families." Michael stepped between them, clearly uncomfortable with the confrontation. "Sarah, I appreciate your concern for the boys, but Dr. Stevens has overseen their care since birth. We have to trust his expertise." As Dr. Stevens gathered his briefcase, he turned back to Sarah. "I'll be visiting more frequently to monitor the children's condition. I trust there will be no more unauthorized interventions." After the doctor left, Sarah found herself alone with Michael in his study. He looked exhausted, like a man carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. "I'm sorry about that," he said quietly. "Dr. Stevens can be intense, but he's saved us from chasing false hopes before." "Mr. Thompson, may I speak freely?" Michael nodded, though his expression remained guarded. "I've worked with blind children before. My younger brother lost his sight in an accident when he was 5. I know what blindness looks like, sounds like, feels like. And what I see in Jack and Peter, it doesn't match." Michael's face tightened. 3 years, Miss Johnson. 3 years and $2.5 million spent consulting with specialists around the world. They all agree. Have they all examined the boys personally? Or are they reviewing Dr. Stevens' initial diagnosis? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Michael stared at her for a long moment, and Sarah saw something flicker in his eyes. Doubt, perhaps, or hope he was afraid to acknowledge. "The boys responded to light changes yesterday," Sarah pressed on. "They tracked sounds with impossible accuracy. They moved through space like children who can see shadows and shapes. Dr. Stevens says that's all neurological compensation." "What if it's not?" Sarah interrupted. "What if it's actual vision that nobody's bothered to test properly?" That afternoon, while Dr. Stevens was seeing other patients and Michael was at work, Sarah made another decision that would prove crucial. She returned to the boys' room, this time with a specific plan. "Jack, Peter, it's Sarah. I want to try something new today." Both boys perked up, their faces brightening in a way that broke her heart. How long had it been since adults approached them with joy instead of pity? Sarah had brought a small flashlight from her cleaning supplies. "I'm going to make some changes in the room, and I want you to tell me if you notice anything different." She dimmed the room completely, then gradually let light in through the curtains. Both boys' heads turned toward the brightening area. She shone the flashlight on the wall, moving it slowly. Both boys followed the movement. She held up her hand between the flashlight and Peter's face, creating a shadow. Peter blinked and moved his head, trying to see around the shadow. Children with complete cortical blindness wouldn't respond to shadows. They wouldn't blink at light. They wouldn't track moving light sources. "Peter, can you see my hand?" Peter scrunched up his face in concentration. I don't know. Something's there. Something dark. "Jack, I'm holding up fingers. Can you tell me how many?" Jack stared intently at her hand, his small face a mask of concentration. "It's hard to see, like looking through water. Maybe 2? Sarah was holding up 3 fingers, but the fact that Jack could perceive any number at all was extraordinary. As she continued her gentle tests, a horrifying possibility began to take shape in her mind. What if Jack and Peter weren't blind at all? What if they had some level of functional vision that had been suppressed by years of being told they couldn't see? She thought about the medical report she'd glimpsed, possible residual light perception. Why hadn't that been explored further? Why were the boys kept in constant darkness if they might be able to perceive light? That evening, Sarah made a phone call that would change everything. "Information? I need the number for the Georgia Board of Medicine." When she reached the licensing board, she asked a simple question. "I need to verify the credentials of Dr. Robert Stevens at the Atlanta Center for Ophthalmology." The answer she received made her blood run cold. Dr. Robert Stevens had been under investigation twice in the past 5 years for insurance fraud and unnecessary procedures. Both cases had been settled quietly, but the pattern was clear. He was a doctor who benefited financially from keeping patients dependent on his care. Sarah hung up the phone and stared out her apartment window toward Buckhead. 2 innocent children were being held prisoner by a false diagnosis, kept in darkness when they might be able to see light. Their father was being bilked out of millions of dollars for treatments that would never work because the children didn't need them. And tomorrow she was going to prove it, even if it cost her the best job she'd ever had. But what she didn't know was that Dr. Stevens had already made his own phone call that evening, and by morning the stakes would be higher than she ever imagined. Sarah arrived at the mansion the next morning to find police cars in the circular driveway. Her heart hammering against her ribs, she approached the front door where Mrs. Helen waited with the expression that mixed worry with barely concealed satisfaction. "Miss Johnson, you're to go directly to Mr. Thompson's study. The authorities need to speak with you." Inside, Sarah found Michael Thompson seated behind his desk, flanked by a uniformed police officer and a stern woman in a business suit who introduced herself as Linda Martinez from Child Protective Services. "Miss Johnson, Officer Williams began, consulting his notepad. "We've received reports that you've been conducting unauthorized medical experiments on 2 disabled children in this home." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She looked at Michael, searching his face for some sign that he knew this was wrong, but his expression was closed off, unreadable. "I played games with them," Sarah said carefully. "Simple games that made them laugh for the first time in years. Dr. Stevens has provided medical documentation showing that any visual stimulation could cause permanent neurological damage to these children," Ms. Martinez said, her voice clinical and cold. "He's recommended immediate psychological evaluation to determine if you've caused lasting harm." Sarah felt the walls closing in around her, but she refused to back down. "Have any of you actually observed Jack and Peter? Have you seen how they respond to—" "Miss Johnson," Michael interrupted, his voice heavy with what sounded like exhaustion. "Dr. Stevens has been their physician for 7 years. He delivered them. He's overseen their care since birth." "Then why?" Sarah said, her voice rising despite her efforts to remain calm. "Does the initial medical report mention residual light perception? Why are these children kept in complete darkness when partial vision could potentially be developed?" The room fell silent. Ms. Martinez made a note on her clipboard. Officer Williams shifted uncomfortably, and Michael Thompson's carefully composed mask slipped just enough for Sarah to see the doubt underneath. "What medical report?" Michael asked quietly. "The one in your kitchen last week. It mentioned possible light perception, but Dr. Stevens's current diagnosis claims complete blindness." Dr. Stevens chose that moment to arrive, sweeping into the room with the confidence of a man accustomed to being the ultimate authority. "I see our discussion yesterday was insufficient, Miss Johnson. Officer Williams, has she admitted to the unauthorized experimentation?" "Dr. Stevens," Sarah turned to face him directly, "why does your original report differ from your current diagnosis?" For just a moment, the doctor's composure faltered. "Medical understanding evolves, Miss Johnson. As the children's condition progressed, it became clear that any residual function was negligible." "Or," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins, "you found it more profitable to maintain a diagnosis that required ongoing expensive consultations rather than pursuing treatment that might actually help these children." The accusation hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Dr. Stevens's face flushed red, and his voice turned dangerously quiet. "That's a serious allegation, Miss Johnson. I hope you're prepared to defend it legally." But Sarah was looking at Michael, watching as understanding began to dawn in his eyes. "Mr. Thompson, when was the last time Jack and Peter had a comprehensive eye exam? Not a consultation, not a review of existing records, but actual testing." Michael's voice was barely a whisper. "Doctor, Stevens said testing would be traumatic for them. Children who've been blind from birth typically aren't traumatized by eye exams, Mr. Thompson. They don't fear what they've never experienced." Ms. Martinez stood up, clearly ready to end this conversation. "Miss Johnson, you're being dismissed from this position immediately. Any further contact with these children will result in criminal charges for child endangerment." As the officials prepared to leave, Sarah made one last desperate attempt. "Mr. Thompson, I'm begging you, get a second opinion. Take them to Emory University Hospital. Let Dr. Christina Davis examine them. She's one of the top pediatric ophthalmologists in the country, and she has no connection to Dr. Stevens." Dr. Stevens laughed coldly. "Doctor, Davis would simply confirm what I've been telling you for years, Thompson. Don't waste your time and money chasing the fantasies of an unqualified domestic worker." After everyone left, Sarah found herself alone in the foyer with Michael. The house seemed quieter than ever, but she could still hear the soft crying from upstairs. Jack and Peter back in their prison of darkness. "Sarah," Michael said, his voice breaking slightly, "I want to believe you. God knows I want to believe that there's hope for my sons. But what if you're wrong? What if putting them through more tests, more disappointment, just makes things worse?" Sarah stepped closer, seeing the father's pain written clearly across his face. "Mr. Thompson, what if I'm right? What if Jack and Peter have been living in unnecessary darkness for 7 years because one doctor decided his bank account was more important than their future?" That evening, as Sarah drove away from Buckhead for what she was certain would be the last time, She didn't know that her words had planted a seed in Michael Thompson's mind that would grow into a determination to finally, definitively, learn the truth about his sons. She also didn't know that upstairs, Jack and Peter sat in their dark room, asking each other in whispers why the nice lady who made them laugh had gone away. "Maybe she'll come back," Jack whispered hopefully. "Maybe," Peter replied, but his 7-year-old voice carried the weight of too much disappointment to hold much hope. What none of them knew was that Sarah Johnson was not done fighting for the Thompson family, and that sometimes losing everything is exactly what it takes to discover the truth. 3 days after Sarah's dismissal, Michael Thompson sat in his study at 2 a.m., staring at a business card. Dr. Christina Davis, Pediatric Ophthalmology, Emory University Hospital. The card had appeared mysteriously in his mailbox that morning, along with a handwritten note. "Sometimes the truth is worth the risk. A friend." The house was silent, except for the grandfather clock ticking away the minutes of another sleepless night. Upstairs, Jack and Peter had cried themselves to sleep again, asking repeatedly when Miss Sarah would return to play games with them. Michael's laptop glowed in the darkness as he researched Dr. Davis. Her credentials were impeccable: Harvard Medical School, residency at Children's Hospital Philadelphia, fellowships in pediatric retinal disorders and cortical visual impairment. Most importantly, she had published papers on misdiagnosed visual conditions in children. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Rose appeared in the doorway, looking as exhausted as he felt. "Mr. Thompson, I need to tell you something about Miss Sarah and the boys." Michael gestured for her to sit. Rose had been with the family since the twins' birth, and her discretion was absolute. "The afternoon Miss Sarah played with them," Rose began hesitantly, "I watched from the hallway. Mr. Thompson, I've never seen those children so alive. They were laughing, moving around, pointing to things. It was like they were different children entirely. Dr. Stevens said any stimulation could harm them. Sir, with respect, those boys have been sitting in darkness for 7 years, barely eating, barely speaking, crying every day. What Miss Sarah did in 30 minutes brought more joy to their faces than I've seen in all my time here." Michael leaned back in his chair, feeling the weight of 7 years of decisions pressing down on him. "Rose, what if Dr. Stevens is right? What if I take them for tests and it gives them false hope?" Rose was quiet for a moment, then spoke with unusual firmness. "Mr. Thompson, what if Miss Sarah is right? What if those children have been trapped in darkness that isn't real?" The next morning, Michael made a decision that would change everything. He called Dr. Davis's office and, using his influence as a prominent businessman, secured an emergency consultation for that afternoon. But as he prepared to leave with the boys, his phone rang. Dr. Stevens's voice was sharp with anger. "Michael, I understand you're considering seeking another opinion. I feel obligated to warn you that this is both unnecessary and potentially dangerous for the children. Dr. Stevens, I just want to be absolutely certain. After 7 years of my care, after the millions you've invested in the best treatments available, Michael, this domestic worker has filled your head with dangerous fantasies. Don't let desperation make you do something you'll regret." Something in the doctor's tone, a note of panic beneath the authority, made Michael more determined than ever. "The appointment is this afternoon, Dr. Stevens. The boys and I will be there." The line went dead. At Emory University Hospital, Dr. Christina Davis proved to be everything her reputation suggested: brilliant, thorough, and genuinely caring. She was a woman in her 40s with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and she approached Jack and Peter with the gentle confidence of someone who truly understood children. "Hello, boys. I'm Dr. Davis. I'd like to look at your eyes today, if that's okay with you." Unlike their usual medical visits, which involved Dr. Stevens speaking only to Michael, while the boys sat silently, Dr. Davis directed her attention to Jack and Peter themselves. "This is going to be just like a game," she explained, settling them into the examination room. "We're going to see what your eyes can tell us." Michael watched in amazement as she conducted tests he'd never seen before, not just shining lights into their eyes, but asking them to track moving objects, to identify shapes, to distinguish between light and shadow. "Jack, I'm holding up some fingers. Can you tell me what you see?" Jack squinted, his face scrunched in concentration. "It's fuzzy, like looking through a dirty window, maybe 3. Dr. Davis was holding up 4 fingers, but she made a note and continued. Peter, I'm going to move this red ball. Tell me when you see it move. Peter's eyes followed the ball's path with remarkable accuracy. It's moving, it's red and it's moving. For 2 hours, Dr. Davis conducted the most comprehensive examination Jack and Peter had ever received. When she finished, she asked Michael to step outside while she spoke with the boys privately. 30 minutes later, she emerged with an expression that was part amazement, part anger. "Mr. Thompson, your sons are not blind." The words hit Michael like lightning. "What do you mean?" "They have approximately 35% functional vision. That's enough to navigate independently, to read large print, to see faces and recognize people. With proper training and corrective lenses, they could attend regular school, play sports, live completely normal lives." Michael felt his legs give way, and he sank into a chair. But Dr. Stevens said, "All the tests." "Mr. Thompson, I need to ask you something difficult. Have you ever sought a second opinion before today?" Dr. Stevens said it would be traumatic for them, that other doctors would just confirm his diagnosis. "Doctor." Davis sat down across from him, her expression grave. "Mr. Thompson, in 30 years of practice, I have never seen a case where a child with functional vision was misdiagnosed as completely blind and kept that way for 7 years. This isn't medical error. This is medical malpractice." As the full implications sank in, Michael felt a rage building that threatened to consume him. 7 years. 7 years of watching his sons suffer in unnecessary darkness. 7 years of believing there was no hope. Millions of dollars spent on treatments for a condition they didn't have. "What do we do now?" he whispered. "Now, we bring your sons into the light, literally and figuratively. But first, I think you should know that someone called my office yesterday and asked me to pay special attention to this case. A young woman named Sarah Johnson. She said she'd been working with your sons and believed they were being misdiagnosed." Michael closed his eyes, thinking of the woman he'd allowed to be dismissed, threatened, and humiliated. The woman who had seen what he, their father, had missed. The woman who had fought for his sons when he was too broken to fight for them himself. "Dr. Davis, what are the legal implications of what you're telling me?" Her expression hardened. "Mr. Thompson, if what I suspect is true, Dr. Stevens hasn't just been negligent. He's been systematically defrauding your insurance company and keeping your children disabled for profit. This is a criminal matter." As they prepared to take Jack and Peter home, where for the first time in 7 years, the curtains would be opened and the lights turned on, Michael made a silent promise to his late wife and to the remarkable woman who had risked everything to save their sons. Justice was coming for Dr. Stevens. But first, he had 2 little boys to introduce to the world of light they'd been denied for far too long. And he had a phone call to make to Sarah Johnson, to ask for her forgiveness and her help in healing the family she'd already begun to save. The drive home from Emory University Hospital was unlike any journey Michael Thompson had ever taken. In the back seat, Jack and Peter pressed their faces against the windows, watching the world blur past with wide-eyed wonder that broke their father's heart, even as it healed it. "Daddy, are those the trees you told us about?" Peter asked, his voice filled with awe as he saw his first glimpse of the towering oaks that lined Atlanta's streets. "Yes, son, those are trees." "They're so big," Jack whispered, "and green. Everything is so green." Michael had to pull over twice during the 20-minute drive because tears blurred his vision so completely he couldn't see to drive. 7 years. 7 years of his sons living in darkness while the world existed in brilliant color just beyond their artificially darkened windows. When they arrived home, Michael stood on the front steps of his Buckhead mansion with Jack and Peter beside him, their small hands gripping his tightly. For the first time in their lives, they were about to see their home. "Are you ready, boys?" 2 small voices answered in unison. "Yes, Daddy." Michael opened the door, and Jack and Peter stepped into the foyer they had navigated by touch and memory for 7 years. Now afternoon sunlight streamed through the tall windows, illuminating the marble floors, the crystal chandelier, the graceful curve of the staircase. Jack let go of his father's hand and walked slowly to the center of the room, turning in a circle, his mouth open in amazement. "Daddy, is this really our house?" "This is your house, son. This has always been your house." Peter had discovered the mirror by the front door. He stood before it, touching his own reflection, seeing his face for the first time. "Daddy, is that me? Do I really look like that?" "You look exactly like that, Peter. You're beautiful, both of you." "Mrs." Helen emerged from the kitchen, took one look at the boys standing in the light and began to cry. Rose appeared at the top of the stairs, saw Jack and Peter looking up at her, actually seeing her, and had to grip the banister to keep from falling. "Miss Rose," Jack called out, pointing up at her. "I can see you. You have yellow hair." "Brown hair, sweetheart," Rose laughed through her tears. "It's brown hair." That evening, Michael made the phone call he'd been both dreading and anticipating. Sarah Johnson answered on the second ring. "Sarah, this is Michael Thompson." There was silence on the other end. Then, "Mr. Thompson, I didn't expect to hear from you." "Sarah, I owe you an apology. A massive, inadequate apology. You were right about everything." He told her about Dr. Davis, about the diagnosis, about Jack and Peter seeing their home for the first time. When he finished, Sarah was quiet for so long he wondered if she'd hung up. "Sarah? Are you there?" "I'm here," she whispered, and he could hear tears in her voice. "How are the boys doing? They want to know when you're coming back to play games with them. Sarah, would you consider returning, not as a housekeeper, as their teacher, their friend, I don't know what to call it, the person who saved their lives?" The next morning, Sarah Johnson returned to 1247 Habersham Road, but this time she walked through the front door as a hero, not as hired help. Jack and Peter rushed to greet her, and for the first time they could see her face when she smiled. "Miss Sarah," Peter threw his arms around her. We can see everything." "I can see you," Jack added, studying her face intently. "You have kind eyes." "I always knew you had kind eyes." Over the following weeks, Sarah worked with the boys every day, helping them develop the vision they'd been denied for so long. She taught them to recognize colors, shapes, faces. She showed them how to read simple words, how to navigate stairs with confidence, how to play games that involve sight. But more than that, she helped them reconnect with the joy of childhood. The mansion that had been a mausoleum of sadness transformed into a home filled with laughter, music, and the sound of children playing. Michael watched this transformation with a mixture of gratitude and guilt that sometimes threatened to overwhelm him. How had he missed what Sarah saw immediately? How had he let Dr. Stevens' lies blind him to his own son's capabilities? The answer came one evening as he found Sarah in his study, researching visual development techniques for the boys. "Sarah, can I ask you something? How did you know? What made you so certain when every doctor said it was impossible?" Sarah looked up from her books, her expression thoughtful. "Mr. Thompson, I lost a daughter when she was just a baby. For months afterward, I blamed myself for not seeing the signs that something was wrong, for not trusting my instincts. I swore I'd never ignore that inner voice again." She paused, looking out the window where Jack and Peter were playing in the garden, visible and happy in the afternoon sunshine. "When I heard your sons crying, I heard the same despair I felt after losing Emma. But children aren't supposed to live in that kind of hopelessness. Something was wrong and I couldn't walk away from it." Michael nodded, understanding. Sarah had fought for his sons because she understood loss, because she recognized pain, and because she had the courage to trust her instincts even when experts told her she was wrong. That night, as he tucked Jack and Peter into their beds now positioned near windows so they could see the stars, Michael made another promise to Jennifer's memory. This time it wasn't about not giving up. It was about making sure that the people responsible for stealing 7 years of his sons' lives would face justice. Dr. Robert Stevens had no idea that his carefully constructed world of lies was about to come crashing down around him. But Michael Thompson, with Sarah Johnson by his side, was about to make sure that no other family would ever suffer what the Thompson family had endured. The fight for Jack and Peter's sight was over. The fight for justice was just beginning. Robert Stevens received the subpoena on a Tuesday morning while enjoying his usual breakfast at the Atlanta Athletic Club. The official Georgia Superior Court document, delivered by a stern-faced process server, accused him of medical fraud, insurance fraud, and child endangerment in connection with his treatment of Jack and Peter Thompson. His coffee cup rattled against the saucer as his hands began to shake. By Wednesday, the story had exploded across Atlanta's media landscape. Prominent doctor accused of keeping children blind for profit. screamed the headline in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Local news stations picked up the story, and by Thursday it had gone national. Michael Thompson stood before a bank of microphones outside the Fulton County Courthouse, flanked by his attorney, Sarah Johnson, and, for the first time ever, Jack and Peter, who squinted slightly in the bright television lights, but stood with the confidence of children who could finally see the world around them. "For 7 years," Michael began, his voice steady despite the emotion underlying every word, "my sons lived in darkness because one man decided his financial gain was more important than their future. We're here today to ensure this never happens to another family." The reporter from Channel 2 Action News raised her hand. "Mr. Thompson, what first made you suspicious of Dr. Stevens's diagnosis?" Michael looked down at his sons, then over at Sarah. "A remarkable woman named Sarah Johnson saw what I was too broken to see. She saw that my sons weren't helpless victims. They were children with tremendous potential who were being kept from reaching it." Sarah stepped forward, still amazed to find herself at the center of such a public battle. Jack and Peter responded to visual stimuli in ways that children with complete blindness simply don't. "When I saw that, I knew something was wrong with their diagnosis." "How are the boys adjusting to having their sight?" asked the reporter from WSB-TV. Jack grinned and stepped closer to the microphone. "It's really, really cool. Yesterday I saw a blue jay for the first time. It was the most beautiful thing ever." Peter nodded enthusiastically. "And Miss Sarah is teaching us to read. Real books with words and pictures." The criminal investigation that followed revealed a conspiracy that was breathtaking in its scope and callousness. Dr. Stevens had been systematically misdiagnosing children with various conditions, keeping them unnecessarily dependent on his care, while billing insurance companies for millions of dollars in fraudulent treatments. Jack and Peter weren't his only victims. Over 15 years, investigators discovered at least 12 other families who had been told their children had incurable conditions that required ongoing expensive care. A 10-year-old girl diagnosed with severe developmental delays who was actually highly intelligent, but suffering from an easily treatable hearing problem. Twin boys told they had degenerative muscle disease who simply needed physical therapy for a minor coordination issue. The financial records painted a picture of a man who had built his lifestyle on the suffering of children and the desperation of their parents. Multiple homes, luxury cars, expensive vacations, all funded by insurance payouts for treatments that weren't necessary for conditions that didn't exist. But perhaps the most damning evidence came from Dr. Stevens's own files. Investigators found notes dating back to Jack and Peter's birth, clearly indicating that the twins had significant residual vision with potential for development. Later notes showed his deliberate decision to suppress this information and maintain the false diagnosis of complete blindness. During the trial, Sarah took the witness stand and described her first interactions with the boys. Her testimony was devastating in its simplicity. "I watched them play for 30 minutes, Your Honor. They tracked sounds with impossible accuracy, responded to changes in light, moved through space with confidence. Most tellingly, they were happy. Children who are being treated appropriately for their actual condition are typically able to find joy in their lives. Jack and Peter had been robbed of joy for 7 years." The defense attorney, clearly grasping at straws, tried to discredit Sarah's observations. "Miss Johnson, you have no medical training. Isn't it possible you misinterpreted normal behaviors for blind children?" Sarah's response silenced the courtroom. "Sir, I raised a blind brother from the age of 5. I know what blindness looks like, sounds like, and feels like. What I saw in Jack and Peter wasn't blindness. It was children with vision who had been convinced they couldn't see." The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Dr. Robert Stevens was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. The Georgia Board of Medicine permanently revoked his license, and civil suits from the affected families resulted in damages exceeding $50 million. But for Michael Thompson and his family, the real victory wasn't legal or financial. It was watching Jack and Peter discover their world with the wide-eyed wonder of children experiencing sight for the first time. 3 months after the trial ended, the boys were enrolled at Westminster Schools, Atlanta's premier private academy. Their teachers reported that despite their late start with visual learning, both boys demonstrated exceptional intelligence and were quickly catching up to their grade level. Michael had also made another decision that surprised no one who knew the family's story. He asked Sarah Johnson to marry him, not from gratitude or obligation, but from genuine love for the woman who had saved his sons and taught him that sometimes the most important truths come from the most unexpected sources. Standing in his study one evening, watching through the window as Sarah played in the garden with Jack and Peter, all three of them laughing as they chased fireflies in the gathering dusk, Michael felt a peace he hadn't experienced since Jennifer's death. His sons could see the stars. They could see each other's faces. They could see the world in all its beauty and complexity, and tomorrow they would wake up in a house filled with light, ready to discover whatever wonders the day might bring. For the first time in 7 years, the future held nothing but possibility. 6 months after Dr. Stevens' conviction, the Thompson mansion had transformed from a house of whispered sorrows into a home bursting with life. Laughter echoed through the halls where silence once reigned, and every window blazed with the natural light that had been forbidden for so long. Jack and Peter had adapted to their new reality with the resilience that children possess in abundance. They raced through their days with an enthusiasm for visual experiences that broke and mended hearts in equal measure. Every sunset was a masterpiece, every flower a miracle, every human face a fascinating study in expressions they were still learning to interpret. "Miss Sarah, look!" Peter called from the garden, holding up a caterpillar he'd discovered on one of the rose bushes. "It's fuzzy and green, and it's moving." Sarah knelt beside him, marveling as she always did at the boy's capacity for wonder. "What do you think it's going to become, Peter?" "A butterfly. We learned about metamorphosis in school. It's going to get beautiful wings and fly." Jack joined them, carefully carrying a butterfly net they'd purchased for their nature explorations. "I want to see a monarch butterfly. Mrs. Chen showed us pictures in science class, and they're orange and black and perfect." These conversations, impossible just months before, filled Sarah with a joy so profound it sometimes brought tears to her eyes. But more than their visual development, she treasured their emotional transformation. The sad, withdrawn children she'd first met had been replaced by curious, confident boys who approached each day as an adventure. Michael emerged from his study, carrying a letter that had arrived that morning from the University of Georgia's College of Medicine. Dr. Christina Davis had nominated the boys' case for inclusion in a major research study on visual development and childhood resilience. "The researchers want to document Jack and Peter's progress," he explained to Sarah, "not as subjects to be studied, but as teachers who can help other families facing similar situations." Sarah nodded, understanding the importance of sharing their story. In the months since Dr. Stevens' arrest, they'd been contacted by dozens of families across the country who suspected their children might also be victims of medical fraud or misdiagnosis. "Are you comfortable with that level of attention?" Michael asked the boys. Jack looked up from the butterfly guide he was studying. "If it helps other kids see like us, then yes. Everyone should get to see butterflies." That evening, after the boys were asleep, Michael and Sarah sat on the back porch watching lightning bugs dance across the garden. The silence between them was comfortable, filled with the shared satisfaction of witnessing daily miracles. "Sarah," Michael said quietly, "I've been thinking about something Dr. Davis mentioned, about creating a foundation to help other families." Sarah turned to face him, seeing the thoughtful expression she'd learned to recognize as his problem-solving mode. "What kind of foundation?" "Something that provides second opinions for children with supposedly incurable conditions. Something that empowers parents to trust their instincts when something doesn't feel right about their child's diagnosis." The idea had been forming in Michael's mind for weeks. He'd received letters from parents across Georgia, across the South, across the nation, families trapped in the same nightmare he'd experienced, told by medical authorities that hope was cruel and acceptance was wisdom. "We could call it the Jack and Peter Foundation," Sarah suggested. "Make it about giving children the chance to reach their full potential, whatever that might be." Michael smiled, reaching for her hand. "I love that. A foundation built on the principle that every child deserves someone who believes in their possibilities." Over the following months, the Jack and Peter Foundation became a reality. Funded initially by Michael's settlement from the medical fraud case, it quickly grew to include donations from families who had been helped, medical professionals who believed in second opinions, and ordinary citizens moved by the boys' story. The foundation's first major success came with the case of Amanda Rodriguez, a 9-year-old girl in rural Georgia who had been diagnosed with severe developmental delays. Her parents, inspired by the Thompson family's story, contacted the foundation for help obtaining a second opinion. Dr. Christina Davis, who had joined the foundation's medical advisory board, examined Amanda and discovered that the child wasn't developmentally delayed at all. She was profoundly gifted, but suffering from severe anxiety that had been misinterpreted as cognitive impairment. With proper support, Amanda flourished, eventually testing into programs for highly intelligent children. "Each child we help," Sarah often said in her speeches to parent groups, "reminds us that labels aren't destinies, diagnoses aren't prison sentences, and sometimes the most important medicine is someone who refuses to give up hope." The foundation also pioneered new protocols for pediatric medical care, working with hospitals across Georgia to implement mandatory second opinion requirements for certain diagnoses, particularly those involving permanent disability or limited life expectancy in children. But perhaps the most meaningful aspect of the foundation's work was the support it provided to parents learning to trust their instincts. Sarah led monthly support groups for families navigating medical complexity, sharing her own story of seeing what experts missed. "You know your child better than anyone," she would remind the worried parents who filled the foundation's conference room. "If something feels wrong, if your child isn't thriving under their current treatment, if you suspect there's more to the story, trust that feeling. You might be the only one who can save them." 1 year after Dr. Stevens's conviction, the foundation held its first annual gala at the Atlanta History Center. Jack and Peter, now confident 8-year-olds, served as the evening's keynote speakers, sharing their story with a ballroom full of doctors, philanthropists, and families touched by medical adversity. "We want to tell you about hope," Jack began, his clear voice carrying to every corner of the elegant room. "Hope is when somebody believes in you, even when everybody else says it's impossible," Peter continued. "Miss Sarah believed in us when we didn't even believe in ourselves," Jack added, looking towards Sarah, who was fighting back tears at their table near the stage. "Now we can see everything," Peter concluded. "We can see colors and birds and books and people's faces when they smile. But most importantly, we can see that every kid deserves someone who fights for them." The standing ovation lasted nearly 5 minutes. As the evening wound down, Michael and Sarah found themselves alone in the foundation's offices, looking at photos from the gala and reading thank you letters from families they'd helped. "Jennifer would be proud," Michael said softly, looking at a picture of Jack and Peter cutting the foundation's ceremonial ribbon. Sarah nodded, understanding that his late wife's presence would always be part of their story. "She would love seeing them so confident, so happy. She would love you," Michael replied, pulling Sarah close, "for fighting for them when I couldn't, for seeing them when I was blind." As they prepared to leave, Sarah paused at a framed photograph on the office wall, Jack and Peter on their first day of regular school, backpacks over their shoulders, big smiles on their faces, squinting slightly in the morning sunshine, but standing straight and proud. Below the photograph was a simple plaque. "Every child deserves to see their own potential." It was a message that would guide the foundation's work for years to come, ensuring that the light Sarah had brought into the Thompson family's darkness would illuminate the path for countless other families still searching for hope in the shadows of impossible diagnoses. The boys who had once sat in darkness, crying for a world they'd never seen, were now beacons of light themselves, proving that sometimes miracles come disguised as ordinary people who refuse to accept that anything is truly impossible. 2 years had passed since that first afternoon, when Sarah Johnson defied orders and played games with 2 crying children in a darkened room. Now she stood in the same room, transformed beyond recognition with bright paint, large windows uncovered to let in the Georgia sunshine, and walls covered with Jack and Peter's artwork, school projects, and photographs of their adventures. The boys, now 9 years old, had grown into confident, curious children who attacked each day with the enthusiasm of people who still marveled at the gift of sight. They were reading at grade level, excelling in school, and had developed a particular passion for nature photography, a hobby that allowed them to capture and share the visual beauty they'd discovered. "Miss Sarah, look at this picture I took of the cardinal," Jack burst into the room, waving a print from his child-friendly camera. The image was slightly blurry but showed a brilliant red bird perched on a branch, framed by green leaves and blue sky. "It's beautiful, Jack. What made you want to photograph that particular cardinal?" "Because he comes to visit us every morning, and I wanted to remember exactly what he looks like. Sometimes I still can't believe colors are real, you know." These moments still took Sarah's breath away. The casual reference to colors, to visual memory, to the simple joy of wanting to remember something beautiful. 2 years ago, Jack couldn't see the cardinal at all. Now he was an amateur photographer, documenting the world he'd discovered. Peter appeared in the doorway, carrying his latest art project from school. "Sarah, Mrs. Patterson says my painting shows remarkable depth perception for someone new to visual arts." "What does that mean?" Sarah examined the watercolor landscape, a child's interpretation of the view from their garden, complete with rolling hills, distant buildings, and a sky that actually conveyed the feeling of depth and space. "It means you're seeing the world in 3 dimensions, Peter. You understand that some things are close and some things are far away, and you can show that in your painting." "Oh," Peter nodded seriously. "That makes sense. Things do look different depending on how far away they are." Another miracle disguised as a casual observation from a 9-year-old. Michael joined them in what had become known as the project room, where the boys worked on homework, art, and their nature photography. He carried a letter that had arrived that morning, one of many similar letters the family received weekly from around the world. "This one's from a family in Australia," he announced. Their daughter was diagnosed with severe autism and told she'd never communicate normally. "After reading about our foundation, they sought a second opinion and discovered she has a rare hearing condition that made normal conversation difficult. She's been fitted with special hearing aids and is now thriving in regular school." Sarah smiled, adding the letter to the growing collection they kept as reminders of why their work mattered. The Jack and Peter Foundation had helped over 200 families in its 2 years of operation, with success stories ranging from misdiagnosed autism to incorrectly identified learning disabilities to cases similar to the boys' own experience with false blindness diagnoses. "Speaking of the foundation," Michael continued, "Dr. Davis called this morning. She wants to nominate Jack and Peter for the National Pediatric Advocacy Award." "What's that?" Jack asked, looking up from organizing his photographs. "It's an award for young people who have helped other children through their own experiences," Sarah explained. "You two have inspired a lot of families to ask harder questions and seek second opinions." Peter considered this seriously. "We didn't really do anything special. We just existed." "Sometimes," Sarah said gently, "existing with courage and hope is the most special thing of all." That afternoon, Sarah received a phone call that brought the story full circle in an unexpected way. Rose, the boys' former nanny, who had witnessed their transformation from withdrawn, hopeless children to thriving, confident boys, was calling with news. "Miss Sarah, I've taken a position with another family. The Hendersons have a 5-year-old daughter who was recently diagnosed with a rare neurological condition. The doctors say she'll never walk or speak normally." Sarah felt her familiar instincts prick up. "What does your intuition tell you about this little girl, Rose?" "The same thing it told me about Jack and Peter when you first started playing with them. Something doesn't feel right about giving up hope so quickly." Within a week, Sarah found herself driving to another wealthy Atlanta neighborhood, this time not as a desperate housekeeper, but as the co-founder of a foundation dedicated to giving children second chances. The parallels were striking. Another grieving parent, another child labeled as incurable, another house where hope had been carefully managed and controlled until it had nearly died. But this time, Sarah arrived with knowledge, resources, and the unwavering certainty that sometimes medical experts are wrong. Sometimes miracles masquerade as simple questions, and sometimes the most important truth is the one that refuses to accept defeat. As she walked up to the Henderson family's front door, Sarah carried with her the voices of Jack and Peter, the support of Michael and the foundation, and the memory of every family they'd helped find their own path from darkness into light. The little girl inside this house didn't know it yet, but she was about to meet someone who believed that every child deserves the chance to exceed the limitations placed on them by others' fears and assumptions. And in a few hours, when Sarah left the Henderson home, she would carry with her the beginning of another story, another family's journey from despair to hope, another child's possibility for a future brighter than anyone dared to imagine. The boys who had once cried in darkness were now lights themselves, illuminating the path for other children still waiting for someone to believe in their hidden potential. Their story had become not just a testament to healing, but a blueprint for hope that would continue to change lives long after their own transformation was complete. As the Georgia sun set over Atlanta, painting the sky in colors that Jack and Peter could now see and appreciate, the Thompson family gathered for dinner, in a house where the curtains were always open, the lights always on, and the future always bright with possibility. 5 years after that first game of Old MacDonald changed everything, Sarah Johnson Thompson stood before the Georgia State Legislature, testifying in support of the Right to Second Opinion bill that would fundamentally change how pediatric medical care was regulated throughout the state. The chamber was packed with families, medical professionals, and advocates whose lives had been touched by the Jack and Peter Foundation's work. In the gallery, now 12 years old, Jack and Peter sat with their father, watching the woman who had become their mother advocate for children they would never meet. "Honorable representatives," Sarah began, her voice steady and clear. "5 years ago, I was a housekeeper who defied medical authority because I couldn't ignore the sound of children crying in unnecessary darkness. Today, those children are honor roll students, accomplished photographers, and living proof that sometimes the most important medical intervention is someone who refuses to accept hopelessness." The bill she was supporting would require all Georgia hospitals to provide families with access to second opinions for pediatric diagnoses involving permanent disability, degenerative conditions, or severely limited life expectancy. It would also establish patient advocate programs and create funding for families who couldn't afford additional consultations. Dr. Christina Davis, now the Foundation's Chief Medical Officer, testified next. "In my 30 years of pediatric medicine, I have never seen legislation more necessary or more urgent. The Thompson case was not an anomaly. It was a spotlight on systemic problems that affect hundreds of children annually." She presented data compiled by the Foundation. Over the past 5 years, they had facilitated second opinions for 847 children initially diagnosed with supposedly incurable conditions. Of those 312, nearly 40%, had received significantly different diagnoses that changed their treatment and prognosis entirely. The statistics were staggering, but it was the individual stories that moved the legislators to action. Parents testified about children misdiagnosed with autism who actually had hearing impairments, kids labeled as intellectually disabled who were dealing with treatable learning differences, and families told their children would never walk who were now running track and field. But perhaps the most powerful testimony came from Jack and Peter themselves. Jack approached the microphone with the confidence of a young man who had learned early that his voice mattered. "My name is Jack Thompson. When I was 7 years old, doctors told my father that I would never see. They said hoping for my vision was cruel, that accepting blindness was wisdom." He paused, looking around the chamber at the faces of people who were hanging on every word. Those doctors were wrong. Not just wrong, they were lying. They kept my brother and me in darkness for 7 years, not because we were blind, but because it was profitable to tell our father we were blind. Peter stepped forward to join his brother. "We lost 7 years of seeing sunsets, reading books, recognizing faces and playing normal games. But other kids don't have to lose anything if this law passes." Jack nodded. "Every child deserves someone who asks the hard questions. Every parent deserves the right to say, 'I want another opinion,' without being made to feel like they're abandoning their child to false hope. Hope," Peter concluded, "isn't false when it leads to truth, and every child deserves both hope and truth." The bill passed by a margin of 94-12, with similar legislation quickly adopted in neighboring states and being considered at the federal level. But the real celebration happened that evening at the Thompson home, where the extended family that had grown around Jack and Peter's story gathered for dinner. Dr. Davis was there, along with Rose, Mrs. Helen, and 24 families whose children had been helped by the Foundation. Amanda Rodriguez, the girl who had been misdiagnosed with developmental delays and was now a sophomore at Georgia Tech studying biomedical engineering, raised a toast. To Sarah, who taught us that sometimes the most important medical training is a mother's heart and the courage to trust what you see with your own eyes. As the evening wound down, Sarah found herself in the garden with Jack and Peter, watching them use their new telescope to observe the constellations they had learned to identify and photograph. The boys had developed into thoughtful, compassionate young men who understood both the fragility and the strength that could come from surviving adversity. "Sarah," Jack said as he adjusted the telescope's focus, "do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't been brave enough to play games with us that first day?" It was a question that had haunted Sarah's dreams sometimes, but tonight she had a clear answer. "I think someone else would have eventually seen what I saw, Jack. Truth has a way of refusing to stay hidden forever." Peter looked up from his star chart. But what if they didn't? What if no one had been brave enough? Sarah considered this, thinking of all the children they'd helped over the years, all the families still waiting for someone to ask the right questions, all the diagnoses that might be accepted too easily because challenging medical authority felt impossible. "Then that's exactly why your story matters, Peter. That's why the Foundation exists, and why the law we pass today will help other families. Sometimes courage is contagious, and one person's willingness to question authority gives other people permission to trust their instincts." Michael joined them in the garden, carrying hot chocolate for everyone, a Thompson family tradition that had evolved during their years of healing together. "I got off the phone with the Foundation's board. They want to expand nationally next year, opening offices in 10 more states." Sarah smiled, watching Jack and Peter return to their stargazing with the casual competence of children who had never known their world could be any different than it was now. "That means more children like you two will get the help they need, and more parents will learn to fight for their kids like Dad learned to fight for us," Jack added, then grinned. "With help from you, of course." As they prepared to head inside, Sarah took one last look around the garden where she had first heard Jack and Peter laugh, where she had first realized they could see more than anyone believed, where she had begun the fight that would eventually change not just their lives but the lives of hundreds of other children. The house behind them glowed with warm light from every window, a beacon of hope visible from the street, a symbol of what was possible when someone refused to accept that darkness was permanent. Tomorrow, Jack and Peter would wake up in a world full of color, possibility, and the knowledge that their story had helped create systemic change to protect other vulnerable children. They would continue their education, pursue their interests, and grow into adults who understood that sometimes the most important advocacy is simply living well and sharing your story with others who need hope. And Sarah would continue her work with the Foundation, knowing that somewhere in Georgia and beyond, there were children still waiting in darkness, not because they couldn't see light, but because no one had yet been brave enough to open their curtains and let the sunshine in. The ripples from two little boys' laughter in a previously silent house continued to spread, creating waves of change that would transform pediatric medicine and give countless families permission to hope, to question, and to believe that miracles sometimes wear the disguise of ordinary people, refusing to accept that anything is truly impossible. 10 years had passed since Sarah's first defiant act of compassion changed the trajectory of 4 lives forever. Now standing in the atrium of the Jack and Peter Thompson Children's Advocacy Center, a gleaming new building on the Emory University campus, she marveled at how far their small act of rebellion had traveled. The center housed not only the Foundation's national headquarters, but also a pediatric second opinion clinic, a family support center, and a research institute dedicated to studying medical misdiagnosis in children. Most importantly, it served as a training ground for a new generation of patient advocates who were learning to see children as individuals with unlimited potential rather than diagnoses with predetermined limitations. Jack and Peter, now 17 and preparing for their senior year at Westminster, moved through the center with the easy confidence of young men who had grown up understanding that their story belonged to more than just them. They volunteered regularly, mentoring younger children and families navigating complex medical situations. "Mrs. Thompson," called out Maria Santos, a 15-year-old who had been diagnosed with selective mutism before the Foundation helped her family discover she had a rare auditory processing disorder that made group conversations overwhelming. "Jack's teaching me how to use the new camera equipment for the photography therapy program." Sarah smiled, watching Jack patiently explain camera settings to Maria, while Peter worked with a group of younger children on an art project designed to help them express their feelings about their medical experiences. Both boys had inherited their father's business acumen and their adoptive mother's intuitive understanding of when someone needed encouragement versus when they needed space to process their emotions. "The applications for the advocacy training program are in," Michael announced as he joined Sarah in observing their son's work. "We have candidates from 37 states and 12 countries who want to learn the Thompson method." The Thompson method had become shorthand for a holistic approach to pediatric medical care that emphasized family intuition, comprehensive second opinions, and the radical belief that every child deserved advocates who saw their potential before their limitations. Medical schools across the country now included courses on family-centered care and the importance of listening to parents' concerns, even when those concerns challenged professional expertise. Dr. Christina Davis emerged from her office carrying a thick folder of research papers. At 58, she had become the leading voice in pediatric medical advocacy, publishing extensively on the psychological and neurological effects of medical misdiagnosis on developing children. "Sarah, the longitudinal study results are in," she announced with barely contained excitement. "The children we've helped over the past 10 years are showing remarkable outcomes across every metric we measured: academic achievement, social development, family relationships, and future aspirations all significantly exceed expected norms." The research had followed 500 children whose families had sought help from the foundation, tracking their progress for an average of 5 years post-diagnosis revision. The results confirmed what Sarah had always believed. Children who were seen and treated as whole individuals with unlimited potential consistently outperformed children who were defined primarily by their medical conditions. "More importantly, Dr. Davis continued, we've documented a 67% reduction in misdiagnosis rates at hospitals that have implemented our second opinion protocols and family advocacy programs." That evening, the Thompson family gathered for their weekly dinner at home, a tradition they'd maintained even as their professional lives grew increasingly demanding. These dinners had evolved into planning sessions for the Foundation's work, homework help for Jack and Peter, and opportunities to decompress from the emotional weight of their advocacy efforts. "Dad, I got my acceptance letter from Emory's pre-med program," Jack announced as they settled around the dining room table. "But I also got accepted to the journalism program at Columbia. I'm thinking about double majoring, medicine and investigative reporting." Michael smiled proudly, following in Sarah's footsteps of asking inconvenient questions. "Someone needs to keep medical professionals honest," Jack replied, with the moral clarity of a young man who had experienced firsthand what happened when authority went unchallenged. Peter, who had been accepted to Georgia Tech's biomedical engineering program, added, "I want to develop technology that makes second opinions more accessible to families who can't afford to travel to major medical centers. Telemedicine, diagnostic AI that flags potential misdiagnoses, family advocacy apps." Sarah felt her heart swell with pride, not just for their academic achievements, but for their understanding that their privileges came with responsibilities to help others. Both boys had grown up watching their story change laws, save children, and transform medical care, and they had internalized the lesson that individual healing was only meaningful when it contributed to collective healing. "Speaking of technology," Michael said, producing a tablet with a video call queue, "we have families waiting to speak with us from around the world. The virtual family support groups have become incredibly popular. For the next 2 hours, they connected with families from Scotland, Brazil, Japan, and rural Montana, parents who were struggling with complex diagnoses, children who wanted to share their recovery stories, and medical professionals who were implementing foundation protocols in their own practices. Each conversation reinforced the same truth Sarah had learned 10 years ago. Children who were believed in consistently exceeded expectations, while children who were written off often fulfilled the limiting prophecies imposed upon them. The last call of the evening came from Dr. James Morrison, a pediatric neurologist in London who had been following Jack and Peter's case since its early international publicity. "I wanted to update you on the Williams family," Dr. Morrison said. "Remember the 3-year-old who was diagnosed with severe cerebral palsy? After implementing your assessment protocols, we've discovered she has a rare but treatable metabolic condition. With proper intervention, we expect her to develop completely normally. These updates had become routine, but they never lost their impact. Every child whose life was changed represented a family saved from years of unnecessary struggle and limitation. As they prepared for bed, Sarah found Jack and Peter in the living room, working on a presentation they were giving the next day to a group of medical students at Emory. "What's your main message going to be?" she asked. Peter looked up from his laptop. "That diagnosis doesn't equal destiny. Just because something can't be cured doesn't mean it can't be improved. And just because an authority figure says something is impossible doesn't mean it's true," Jack added, "and that sometimes the most important medical intervention is someone who refuses to give up hope." Sarah kissed both boys goodnight, still marveling at the confident, compassionate young men they had become. Their childhood had been marked by trauma and recovery, but their adolescence had been defined by purpose and service to others. As she turned off the lights in their home, every window still uncurtained, every room still filled with the natural light that symbolized their family's journey from darkness, Sarah reflected on the unexpected path that had led her from East Atlanta domestic worker to nationally recognized child advocate. She thought about the hundreds of children whose stories had intersected with theirs, the families who had found courage in Jack and Peter's recovery, the medical professionals who had changed their practices after witnessing the power of hope combined with rigorous second opinions. Most of all, she thought about the children still waiting in darkness somewhere. Not physical darkness like Jack and Peter had endured, but the darkness of limited expectations, unquestioned diagnoses, and families who hadn't yet learned that fighting for their child's potential was not only acceptable but necessary. Tomorrow the foundation would continue its work, Jack and Peter would continue their education and advocacy, and Sarah would continue asking the inconvenient questions that saved children from unnecessary limitations. The light that had begun with two little boys laughing at games in a previously silent room had become a beacon visible around the world, proving that sometimes the most powerful force for change is simply refusing to accept that anyone's story has to end in darkness. 20 years after Sarah Johnson first heard two children crying and decided to break the rules to help them, she stood in the Rose Garden of the White House watching President Martinez sign the National Pediatric Advocacy Act into law. The legislation, inspired by the Jack and Peter Foundation's work, would mandate second opinion access for all American children diagnosed with chronic or life-limiting conditions. Jack Thompson Davis, now 27 and completing his residency in pediatric neurology at Johns Hopkins, stood beside her. His hyphenated last name honored both his adoptive mother Sarah and his mentor Dr. Christina Davis, who had become like a grandmother to him. His twin brother Peter, a successful biomedical engineer who had developed revolutionary diagnostic software, watched the ceremony via live stream from Geneva, where he was presenting his work to the World Health Organization. 20 years ago, those two boys couldn't see this moment, Sarah whispered to Michael, as they watched their son shake hands with the president. Now one of them is going to be the doctor who prevents other children from going through what they experienced. Michael, now in his 60s but still vigorous and passionate about their foundation's work, squeezed her hand. Jennifer would be amazed at what her sons have accomplished. The ceremony concluded with President Martinez reading a letter from the twins, now grown men whose childhood story had sparked international change in pediatric medicine. To every child who has been told their condition is hopeless, to every parent who has been made to feel foolish for wanting a second opinion, to every medical professional who has the courage to question established diagnoses, this law is for you. Our story began with one person who refused to accept that children should live in unnecessary darkness. Let this law ensure that every child has someone willing to turn on the lights. After the ceremony, Sarah found herself in the White House garden with Dr. Davis, now 82 but still sharp and passionate about children's advocacy. Together, they watched Jack being interviewed by reporters about his upcoming work establishing pediatric second opinion clinics in underserved rural areas. "He has your gift," Dr. Davis observed, "of seeing potential where others see limitations." "He has his father's determination and his biological mother's compassion," Sarah replied. "But mostly he has the understanding that comes from surviving something that should never have happened to him." That evening, At the celebration dinner hosted by the foundation, Sarah received a video call from Peter in Geneva. Behind him, representatives from 43 countries were visible in a conference room, all working on implementing international standards for pediatric medical advocacy. "Sarah," Peter said, his face glowing with excitement, "we've just gotten approval for the Global Children's Medical Rights Initiative. Every country that signs on will be required to provide second opinions for children, establish family advocacy programs, and create reporting systems for potential medical errors." The irony wasn't lost on any of them. 2 boys who had been kept in artificial darkness were now illuminating medical practices around the world. But perhaps the most meaningful moment of the evening came when Jack announced his engagement to Dr. Amanda Rodriguez, the young woman who had been misdiagnosed with developmental delays and was now herself a pediatric psychiatrist specializing in medical trauma. "Amanda and I want to dedicate our lives to making sure no child experiences what we experienced," Jack said, his arm around his fiancée. "Medical error, misdiagnosis, and families being told to abandon hope. Our engagement isn't just personal, it's professional. We're going to spend our careers fighting for children who need advocates." Amanda stepped forward, her voice strong and clear. "Jack and Peter's story saved my life 20 years ago. Now it's our turn to save other children's lives. We're announcing the establishment of the Thompson-Rodriguez Institute for Pediatric Medical Justice, which will provide legal advocacy for families fighting medical malpractice and systemic discrimination against children with disabilities." As the evening concluded, Sarah found herself in a quiet corner with the scrapbook she had been keeping since Jack and Peter's recovery began. 20 years of newspaper articles, medical journal publications, letters from families they'd helped, photos of children who were thriving after receiving second opinions, and documentation of the systematic changes their story had sparked. The first entry was a photo from Jack and Peter's 9th birthday party, the first birthday party they had ever actually seen. Their faces were bright with wonder as they looked at their colorfully decorated cake, seeing birthday candles for the first time. The most recent entry was a research paper published that month documenting a 78% reduction in pediatric misdiagnosis rates at hospitals using Thompson method protocols. Between those entries were hundreds of stories. Children who learned to walk after being told they never would, kids who excelled academically after being labeled intellectually disabled, families who found hope after being counseled to abandon it. Michael joined her, carrying 2 glasses of wine and wearing the gentle smile that had become his trademark since their family learned to live in light instead of darkness. "Penny, for your thoughts." Sarah closed the scrapbook and looked around the room at their extended family, Dr. Davis holding court with a group of young medical students, Jack and Amanda planning their institute, colleagues from around the world sharing stories of children they'd helped, parents whose lives had been changed by learning to advocate for their children. "I was thinking about that first day when I heard them crying and decided to disobey orders. I never imagined that 30 minutes of playing games could lead to all this." Michael sat beside her, his expression thoughtful. "I've been thinking about that day too. Not just what you did, but what I didn't do. For 7 years I accepted what I was told, instead of trusting what I should have seen. You were grieving, Jennifer, and trying to do the best you could with impossible information," Sarah replied gently. "That's different from giving up." "But you weren't grieving any less than I was," Michael pointed out. "You had lost Emma, but you still had the courage to hope for my sons when I couldn't hope for them myself." Sarah considered this, thinking about the mystery of resilience and how some people find the strength to fight when others find reasons to surrender. "Maybe grief taught me that hopelessness is more dangerous than hope. Maybe losing Emma made me understand that giving up on children is never acceptable." As they prepared to leave the celebration, Sarah received one final surprise of the evening, a video message from a 12-year-old girl in rural Alabama whose family had contacted the foundation earlier that year. "Mrs. Thompson," the girl said, speaking clearly into her family's phone camera, "6 months ago, doctors told my parents I would never speak because of my autism. I wanted to say thank you for teaching my parents that it's okay to ask questions when something doesn't feel right." The girl paused, then added with the wisdom of a child who had experienced both limitation and liberation, "I think every kid deserves someone like you who believes they can be more than their diagnosis says they can be." As they drove home through the streets of Atlanta, past the neighborhoods where their story had begun, Sarah reflected on the unexpected journey that had taken a housekeeper's instinct and transformed it into a global movement for children's medical rights. But you helped them get a second opinion, and it turned out I don't have autism at all. I have a hearing condition that's totally treatable. Now I can hear properly, and I can talk, and I'm making friends at school. Tomorrow Jack would return to his residency, continuing his training to become the kind of doctor who listened to parents and questioned established diagnoses. Peter would continue his work developing technology to make medical advocacy more accessible to families around the world. The foundation would continue helping children whose potential was being limited by inadequate or incorrect medical care. And somewhere in hospitals and homes across the globe, children who might otherwise have been written off were being given second chances because two little boys had been brave enough to laugh in the darkness, and one woman had been brave enough to turn on the lights. The story that had begun with tears in a silent mansion had become a symphony of hope, playing in the lives of thousands of children who would never have to accept limitations imposed by others' failures of imagination or courage. 25 years after that first game of Old MacDonald Had a Farm changed everything, Sarah Thompson stood in the entry hall of 1247 Habersham Road, watching her granddaughter Emma, named for the daughter Sarah had lost, take her first tentative steps across the same marble floor where Jack and Peter had once navigated by touch and memory. At 15 months, Emma moved with the confident curiosity of a child who had never known darkness, literal or metaphorical. Her parents, Jack and Amanda, watched from the doorway of Michael's study, their faces glowing with the particular joy of parents who understood that every milestone was a gift to be celebrated rather than an expectation to be taken for granted. "Gamma Sarah," Emma called out, using her toddler version of Grandma Sarah, as she wobbled toward the woman who had become the foundation of their family's understanding of hope and possibility. Sarah swept the little girl into her arms, marveling as she always did at the weight of living potential, the warmth of a child who would grow up knowing that every person deserved advocates and every diagnosis deserved questioning. "She has your eyes," Michael observed, joining them with the gentle smile that had replaced the broken expression he'd worn for so many years. "And your stubbornness, I suspect." Peter's voice came from the tablet propped on the foyer table, connecting them via video call from Stockholm, where he was receiving the Nobel Prize in Medicine for his work developing artificial intelligence systems that could detect medical misdiagnosis in real time. "I can't believe Emma's walking already," Peter said, his image pixelated but his joy unmistakable. "Jack, make sure you're documenting this. Our family understands better than most that every step forward is a victory." The house had evolved over the years into something that would have been unimaginable when Sarah first heard two children crying behind closed doors. Now it served as both the Thompson family home and the international headquarters for what had grown into the largest children's medical advocacy organization in the world. The Foundation's work had expanded beyond second opinions to include research, policy advocacy, direct legal representation, and a global network of family support services. Most importantly, it had trained over 10,000 medical professionals in what was now called the Thompson Protocol, a comprehensive approach to pediatric care that prioritized family insights and systematic verification of diagnoses involving permanent limitations. "Emma, do you want to see the pictures of your daddy and Uncle Peter when they were little boys?" Sarah asked, carrying the toddler to the photo wall that chronicled their family's journey from darkness to light. Emma pointed at a picture of 7-year-old Jack and Peter, taken just weeks after their recovery began. In the photograph, they were squinting in bright sunlight, their faces still bearing traces of the sadness that had marked their early years. But their eyes, their beautiful, seeing eyes, were bright with wonder at the visual world they were discovering. "Daddy!" Emma declared with the certainty of a child who knew she was loved and cherished. "That's right, sweetheart. That's Daddy when he learned to see." Amanda joined them, carrying Emma's diaper bag and the comfortable confidence of a mother who had grown up understanding that challenges were temporary and potential was limitless. "Jack's running late from the hospital, but he should be here soon. His residents are presenting the monthly misdiagnosis prevention cases today." The tradition had become a cornerstone of Jack's teaching methodology. Each month, residents at Emory Children's Hospital presented cases where initial diagnoses had been questioned, revised, and ultimately corrected, continuing the culture of humble inquiry that the Thompson family's story had sparked throughout the medical community. Dr. Christina Davis, now 87 and still sharp as ever, emerged from the library where she had been video conferencing with medical schools in 12 countries about implementing Thompson protocol training. Despite her age, she remained the Foundation's chief medical officer and the world's leading expert on pediatric diagnostic accuracy. "Sarah, the latest research results are extraordinary," she announced. "Children treated at hospitals using our protocols show a 91% reduction in long-term disability classifications and an 84% increase in achieving developmental milestones previously considered impossible." But the statistics, impressive as they were, paled beside the individual stories that continued to pour in daily. Letters from families whose children had been written off and then flourished, thank you notes from young adults who were pursuing careers they'd been told would be impossible, wedding invitations from couples who had met in support groups for families dealing with medical complexity. Jack arrived just as they were sitting down for their weekly family dinner, his face flushed with excitement from his day at the hospital. At 32, he had become the youngest department chief in Emory's history. But more importantly, he had developed a reputation as the pediatric neurologist who never accepted hopelessness as a valid diagnosis. "You'll never guess what happened today," he said, kissing Emma and settling into the chair that had been his since childhood. A family brought in their 8-year-old daughter who was diagnosed with severe autism 3 years ago. The parents said something didn't feel right about the diagnosis, but they'd been told questioning it would harm their child. Sarah felt her familiar instincts prick up. "What did your examination reveal?" "She doesn't have autism at all. She has a rare auditory processing disorder that makes social interaction overwhelming. With the right hearing aids and therapy, she'll likely develop completely normally." But Sarah, the most amazing part was what the mother said when I explained the real diagnosis. Jack paused, his expression soft with emotion. She said, "Thank you for believing that it was okay for me to trust my instincts. I learned that from reading about the Thompson family, that parents who love their children usually know when something isn't right, even when experts say everything is fine." These moments still took Sarah's breath away, the realization that their story continued to echo through the lives of families they would never meet, giving other parents permission to question, to hope, and to fight for their children's potential. As dinner wound down and Emma played contentedly with blocks on the floor, seeing the colors, understanding spatial relationships, developing normally because she lived in a world where her development was supported rather than limited, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. 25 years ago, she had been a grieving young woman working as a housekeeper, carrying the pain of her own lost child and the wisdom that comes from surviving devastating loss. Today, she was the grandmother of a healthy toddler, the co-founder of an organization that had helped over 50,000 children worldwide, and the adoptive mother of 2 men whose recovery had sparked a global revolution in pediatric medicine. "Penny for your thoughts?" Michael asked, using the phrase that had become their private code for the quiet moments when the magnitude of their journey felt overwhelming. Sarah looked around the dining room table at their extraordinary family, Jack documenting Emma's every move with the diligence of a parent who understood that development was precious. Amanda planning the next expansion of their legal advocacy program, Peter joining them virtually from Stockholm where he was changing the world through technology, Dr. Davis reviewing research that would shape the next generation of medical training. "I was thinking about that first afternoon when I heard Jack and Peter crying," she said. "How I almost talked myself out of defying orders and going upstairs." "What changed your mind?" Amanda asked. She had heard the story countless times, but she never tired of the details that had shaped her husband's life and their family's mission. Sarah considered the question, thinking about the mystery of moral courage and how ordinary people sometimes find the strength to do extraordinary things. "I think it was Emma, my first daughter, the one I lost. Her death taught me that children's lives are too precious to waste on adult assumptions about what's possible. I couldn't walk away from the sound of children in pain, even if helping them meant risking my job." Emma toddled over to Sarah's chair, pulling herself up and reaching for her grandmother's face with the casual confidence of a child who had never known anything but love and acceptance. "Gamma," she said clearly. "Up." Sarah lifted her granddaughter, feeling the solid weight of future potential, the warm promise of a child who would grow up in a world where her gifts would be nurtured rather than her limitations assumed. As the evening concluded and their family began to scatter, Jack and Amanda heading home to put Emma to bed, Peter signing off from Stockholm to accept his Nobel Prize, Dr. Davis retiring to her apartment in the mansion's converted carriage house, Sarah found herself alone with Michael, in the room where their story had truly begun. The former study had been converted into a memorial room, honoring the children whose stories had intersected with theirs over the years. Photos covered the walls. Children who had learned to walk after being told they never would, kids who had excelled in college after being labeled intellectually disabled, young adults who were pursuing medical careers inspired by their own experiences with misdiagnosis. In the center of the room stood a simple plaque, in memory of every child who was told their limitations were permanent, and in celebration of every child who proved that diagnosis doesn't equal destiny. "Do you think we've done enough?" Michael asked, a question that had haunted both of them over the years as their foundation's work expanded globally. Sarah considered the question, thinking about the thousands of children they'd helped, the millions who had been protected by the laws and protocols their advocacy had created, the countless families who had been given permission to hope and fight for their children's potential. "We've done what we could," she said finally. "But more importantly, we've created a movement that will continue long after we're gone." Jack and Amanda, Peter and his team, the medical professionals we've trained, the families we've empowered, they'll all keep carrying this work forward. As they prepared to turn off the lights and head upstairs, Sarah took one last look around the room that had witnessed so much transformation. 25 years ago, it had been the study of a broken man who had given up hope for his sons. Tonight, it was a shrine to the power of refusing to accept that any child's story had to end in limitation. Tomorrow, the Foundation would continue its work, helping new families navigate complex medical situations and advocating for children whose potential was being limited by inadequate care. Jack would continue training the next generation of pediatric specialists to question established diagnoses and listen to parents' concerns. Peter would continue developing technology to make medical advocacy more accessible to families around the world. And somewhere in hospitals and homes across the globe, children who might otherwise have been written off would be given second chances because two little boys had been brave enough to laugh in the darkness. One woman had been brave enough to turn on the lights, and their story had become a beacon of hope for families still searching for answers in the shadows of impossible diagnoses. The house that had once echoed with the sound of children crying in unnecessary darkness now hummed with the quiet satisfaction of a job well done, not finished perhaps, but passed on to capable hands that would continue the work of ensuring that every child had someone willing to fight for their unlimited potential. As Sarah turned off the lights in the memorial room, she smiled at the thought of Emma growing up in a world where her grandmother's simple act of defiance had become a global standard of care, where no child would have to wait in darkness for someone brave enough to believe in their light. The story that began with tears had become a symphony of hope, and its music would play on in the lives of countless children yet to be born, each one deserving of advocates who saw their possibilities before their limitations, their potential before their diagnosis, their light before any darkness that might temporarily surround them. In the end, perhaps that was the greatest gift Sarah Johnson had given the world, not just the healing of two specific children, but the understanding that every child deserved someone willing to turn on the lights and refuse to accept that anyone's future had to be lived in unnecessary darkness.